Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. It was winter, and Vermont's mountains were buried in thick layers of fresh snow. The air was crisp, sharp in the way only an early morning frost can be, and it seemed like the perfect time for a trip. Meredith had asked me to join her for a weekend getaway to her family's cabin near Stone Mountain Resort. We weren't officially dating yet, but we spent so much time together that it felt inevitable. Every time we were together, there was this electricity between us. It was only a matter of time before we both admitted what we already knew. This trip felt like the start of something. The drive from Boston was long, 5 hours of winding roads, each bend bringing us deeper into the wilderness. The further we went, the fewer cars we saw. As we neared the cabin, the thick trees of the Vermont woods seemed to swallow the road. Houses became sparse, nothing but occasional flashes of light in the distant windows of other isolated cabins. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows over the snow-covered landscape. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how quiet. "We'll have the whole place to ourselves," Meredith said with a playful smile as she turned the car into the narrow driveway. The cabin came into view, a small but charming structure nestled between towering pines, the kind of place you see in postcards or brochures about the beauty of the great outdoors. It was built of dark wood with large windows overlooking the vast stretch of forest beyond. You could barely make out another house down the road, and even that seemed a mile away. The isolation, which had felt peaceful during the drive, now struck me as something more. Lonely, maybe? But it was nice, or at least that's what I told myself. We spent the first night settling in, the fireplace crackling with warmth as we unpacked our things and prepared for the next day. Meredith was excited, her cheeks flushed from the cold as she rattled on about the slopes we'd hit in the morning. I remember her laughing about how quiet it was, how nobody really lived up there. Most of the houses were owned by people who came up for the ski season or weekend trips, and in the off-season, the area was almost entirely deserted. That night, we slept soundly, wrapped in layers of blankets as the wind howled outside. It was around dawn when I woke up first. The room was cold, much colder than it had been when we fell asleep. I got up, hoping to stoke the fire before Meredith woke, but as I pulled on my boots and opened the front door to grab some firewood, I froze. There were footprints in the snow. They weren't ours, and they weren't from an animal either. They were distinctly human, deep impressions of boots, the kind someone might wear if they were trekking through the snow. The tracks circled the cabin. They started from the side of the house, passed in front of the windows, and continued around the back before disappearing into the woods. I stepped outside cautiously, my breath coming out in visible clouds. I looked around, but everything was still. The woods loomed dark and dense around us, and there wasn't a sound except the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. "Meredith?" I called softly as I stepped back inside, shutting the door behind me. She was still in bed, barely stirring. When I shook her awake and told her about the footprints, she rubbed her eyes and dismissed it quickly. "It's probably just a bear," she mumbled, pulling the covers over her head. "There are black bears all over these mountains, and they wander around this area a lot. Could have been looking for food." But these footprints weren't from a bear. They were too regular, too deliberate. But I didn't push it. We had planned this trip to relax, to have fun. I didn't want to start it off by freaking out over something that might be nothing. The day went by without incident. We spent hours on the slopes, carving our way down the mountain, laughing and racing each other down the trails. By the time we returned to the cabin, our muscles were sore, and we were both exhausted. After dinner, Meredith curled up with a book while I stepped outside to use the outhouse, which was a short walk behind the cabin. The air outside had grown colder, biting at my exposed skin. As I stood there in the stillness, I heard it, a faint crunching sound. Footsteps. They were deliberate, slow, like someone trying to avoid making noise but failing. I looked around quickly, but the only thing that greeted me was the oppressive quiet of the forest. My heart pounded as I hurried back to the cabin, the sound of those steps lingering in my mind. When I reached the porch, I noticed something odd. The lights in the cabin were off. I had left them on. I'm sure of it. The warmth of the fireplace and the glow of the lamps had been spilling out through the windows when I walked out just minutes ago. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, Meredith was standing by the window, her face pale. "There was someone out there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was sitting here when I heard the door handle move. I thought it was you, but when I looked out, I saw some man, standing by the window. He was just staring at me." My stomach twisted, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. "What did he look like?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't know. He was wearing a hood, and it was too dark to see his face. But he tried the door again. When he couldn't get in, he walked around the house, looking through the windows." We both stood in silence, listening. But there was nothing now, just the occasional creak of the house settling and the faint whistling of the wind outside. Meredith quickly locked the door, pulling the blinds down over the windows. I could feel her fear. It mirrored my own. "We need to be careful," I whispered, trying to stay calm. "Let's grab something from the basement in case he comes back." Together, we crept down the narrow stairs into the small, cold basement. There wasn't much, just old boxes and tools, but we found an old hunting rifle and a few kitchen knives that could serve as makeshift weapons. The air was thick with tension as we waited, crouched in the dark, listening to every sound. For hours, there was nothing. But neither of us slept, too afraid to let our guard down. Just as I started to think maybe he had left for good, there it was again, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps outside. Someone was back. The night had grown unnaturally quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The air inside the cabin felt thick, suffocating with the tension. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the wooden floor, the crackle of the dying fire, and most hauntingly, the soft crunch of footsteps outside. "Did you hear that?" Meredith's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the blood rushing in my ears. I nodded, gripping the rifle tighter. The footsteps weren't far, pacing just beyond the front door. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't in a hurry to leave. "I'll go check," I muttered, more to reassure myself than her. The idea of stepping outside into the darkness filled me with dread, but there was no other option. We couldn't just sit and wait for whoever it was to break in. Meredith's hand shot out, grabbing my arm before I could move. "Be careful," she pleaded, her eyes wide with fear. With a nod, I moved slowly towards the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath, steeling myself before throwing it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and the snow crunched loudly beneath my boots as I stepped outside. I scanned the area, my breath coming out in visible clouds. At first, it looked like nothing had changed. The snow was untouched, except for the footprints I had noticed earlier. But as I walked further around the side of the cabin, I saw them again, new prints, deeper, fresher. They led away from the house and disappeared into the thick line of trees that bordered the clearing. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping to scare off whoever was out there. No response. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted from tree to tree, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. But the woods remained still, unnervingly silent. I fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing through the mountains like a thunderclap. For a moment, everything was still. And then, just as quickly, the footsteps resumed, fading deeper into the woods. I hurried back inside, slamming the door behind me. "I think he's gone," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. The feeling of being watched still lingered, crawling under my skin like an invisible threat. Meredith was pacing nervously by the window, her face pale and drawn. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "What if he comes back? What if he's not alone?" I didn't have an answer. The cabin, once a cozy and safe retreat, now felt like a trap. The walls seemed to close in around us, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something. "We'll leave at first light," I finally said. But for now, we need to stay quiet and keep watch." Meredith nodded, though the fear in her eyes didn't lessen. We sat in the dark, the rifle resting in my lap, waiting for the first sign of dawn. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. Around 4 a.m., the footsteps returned. They were slow and deliberate, circling the cabin again. This time, though, they didn't stay outside. The faint sound of the door handle rattling made my blood run cold. "Did you lock the door?" Meredith whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if the flimsy lock would be enough to keep out whoever, or whatever, was out there. The rattling stopped, but the footsteps didn't. They moved to the windows, the glass trembling slightly as if someone was pressing their face against it, peering inside. We stayed perfectly still, holding our breath, praying that they wouldn't see us in the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps faded away, retreating into the woods once again. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept through the blinds that we dared to move. I cautiously opened the door, my eyes scanning the clearing for any sign of movement. The footprints were there again, deeper than before, but they led away from the cabin. "We need to go," Meredith said, her voice trembling. "Now." I couldn't agree more. We packed our things quickly, neither of us speaking much. The cabin, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt like a haunted place, filled with shadows and fear. We were both eager to leave it behind. As we drove away, the snow-covered landscape seemed to stretch endlessly around us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every shadow in the trees felt like it was watching, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Meredith called her father as soon as we had cell service, explaining what had happened. He didn't sound surprised. "There've been stories," he said quietly, "about someone living up there in the woods, watching people. It's why a lot of folks don't stay there during the off-season." We never went back to the cabin after that. It was the winter of 2018, and the snow in England had been falling relentlessly for days, leaving everything outside wrapped in a thick, white blanket. My family had been planning a trip to Cornwall to visit some relatives, but I wasn't feeling it. The idea of long car rides, sitting around in a house full of extended family, and making small talk felt like a nightmare. So, I did what any rational person would do. I faked being sick. It wasn't hard to sell. A bit of a cough, a tired voice, and they were convinced. Mom wasn't thrilled, but I convinced her that I'd be fine alone. I'm 24 years old, after all. Plus, we had Jasper, our dog, to keep me company. By the time they left, I was already feeling the sweet relief of solitude. With the house to myself, I planned to enjoy every second of it. The snow kept falling outside, creating a kind of peaceful quiet that made everything feel distant and safe. I spent the day exactly how I wanted, playing games, watching Netflix, and letting Jasper run around in the backyard, his paws disappearing into the snow. There was something about watching him leap through the drifts that made everything feel almost perfect. By early evening, I realized I was getting hungry, and the food in the fridge wasn't exactly appealing. I decided to walk down to the fish and chips shop at the corner. It wasn't far, just a few minutes away, and the cold air was refreshing after being cooped up inside. Jasper was content after a long play session, so I left him behind and bundled up, pulling my jacket tight against the biting wind. The snow had quieted the whole neighborhood, making the walk feel almost surreal. My boots crunched softly underfoot, and everything seemed muffled. I was the only one outside, or at least I thought so. The streetlights flickered as the wind picked up, casting strange, elongated shadows over the snow-covered ground. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind and the cold playing tricks. But as I neared the line of trees that separated my street from the small park nearby, I heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving quickly through the underbrush. I stopped for a moment, straining to listen, my breath fogging up in the frigid air. At first I thought it was just a deer or maybe a stray dog, but the sound continued, growing louder, more deliberate. There was a pattern to it, almost like footsteps. I picked up my pace. I turned onto the small path leading to the fish and chip shop, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But the closer I got to the shop, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It was something else. My heart started to race as I passed under another streetlight. That's when I saw it, a shadow, just at the edge of the trees, moving swiftly and silently in the same direction as me. I stopped again, my pulse quickening. The shadow stopped too. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark figure that seemed too large to be an animal. It was watching me. I could feel it. I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, almost at a jog. The shop was just up ahead, its warm, yellow lights glowing through the falling snow. I could smell the fried fish even before I reached the door, but it didn't comfort me like it usually did. I glanced back over my shoulder as I pulled open the door to the shop. The shadow was gone. Inside, the warmth hit me like a wave, and for a brief moment, I felt safe again. I ordered my food, making small talk with the guy behind the counter, but my mind kept wandering back to that shadow. What had it been? I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, or maybe some teenager playing a prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. When I left the shop, food in hand, the streets were even emptier than before. The wind had picked up, sending small swirls of snow dancing across the ground. I quickened my pace, eager to get home and lock the door behind me. The shadows seemed longer, the night darker, as I retraced my steps. And then I heard it again, those footsteps, faint at first, but unmistakable. I didn't look back this time. I didn't want to know what was following me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming out in short, sharp bursts. The snow made it hard to run, but I pushed myself, practically sprinting the last few yards to my front door. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once in my panic, before finally shoving them into the lock and bursting inside. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hands trembling. Jasper came bounding over, barking excitedly, completely oblivious to the fear that was coursing through me. I took a deep breath, telling myself that I was safe now, that it had been nothing. But as I set the food down on the kitchen table, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced around the house. Everything seemed in place. I walked to the back door, just to be sure I had locked it earlier. It was closed, just as I'd left it. For a moment, I felt stupid. Maybe I had overreacted. The snow, the cold, the isolation, it was getting to me. I told myself to calm down and just enjoy my food. But then Jasper started barking again, a low, growling sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned to him, confused, but he was staring intently at the back door, his body tense. My heart skipped a beat. I walked slowly to the door and hesitated before reaching for the handle. That's when I saw it. The door wasn't locked. In fact, it wasn't even closed. It was open, just a crack, enough for the cold wind to seep through. And I was sure I hadn't opened it. The back door was ajar. Cold air crept into the house, bringing with it a sense of dread that settled deep in my chest. I stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at the door. I hadn't opened it. I knew I hadn't. Jasper's low growl echoed behind me, his body stiff and on edge. He sensed it too, something wasn't right. I reached out, slowly, my hand trembling as I pushed the door shut. The lock clicked into place, but it did nothing to calm the rising panic in my throat. Someone, or something, had opened that door. I could feel my heart racing, the blood pounding in my ears as I backed away, my eyes flicking to every shadow in the room. Every corner suddenly seemed darker, more sinister. Jasper barked again, louder this time, his attention still fixed on the door. He barked at things like squirrels or delivery drivers, but this was different. It wasn't his usual playful yapping, it was guttural, protective. I turned toward him, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is it, boy? What's out there?" He didn't respond, just kept growling at the door like he could see something I couldn't. My stomach twisted with fear, and I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter, instinctively dialing my parents. But of course, there was no answer. They were hours away in Cornwall. I could already picture my mom's face when she saw the missed call and the panic that would set in. I couldn't call them now. I was alone, and I had to deal with whatever this was. I stood in the kitchen, the silence pressing in around me, trying to figure out what to do next. I told myself it was probably nothing, just a gust of wind that had somehow pushed the door open. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense that someone had been right there, in my house. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not from outside this time, but from upstairs. My heart dropped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The floor above me creaked ever so slightly, as if someone was moving carefully, trying not to be heard. But I heard it. I felt it. Jasper went silent, his ears perked up, his head turning toward the stairs. He stared, unmoving, as if he were waiting for something to happen. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, like whoever, or whatever it was, didn't care that I could hear them now. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab Jasper and bolt out the front door, but I was paralyzed. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it a burglar? Someone who had been watching the house, waiting for my family to leave? Or was it something worse, something I couldn't explain? The footsteps stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that suffocates, that presses in from all sides. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear any movement from above. But there was nothing now, just the ticking of the clock in the living room and the faint sound of the wind outside. I forced myself to move, inching toward the stairs, my hands shaking so badly that I had to grip the railing to steady myself. Jasper followed close behind, his growl low but steady. I needed to know who was up there. I needed to see with my own eyes, even though every instinct in my body was screaming for me to run. I crept up the stairs, my heart pounding louder with each step. The hallway at the top was dark, and the door to my bedroom was slightly ajar, just like the back door had been. I reached the landing, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and pushed the door open a little wider. The room was empty. Nothing. No one. The window was closed, the curtains drawn, everything just as I had left it. I stood there, feeling a wave of relief and confusion wash over me. Had I imagined it? Maybe the creaking was just the old house settling under the weight of the snow, maybe the wind had. But then Jasper barked again, a sharp, frantic sound that made my blood run cold. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. The closet door was open. Wide open. I hadn't touched it. I knew I hadn't touched it. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back, staring at the dark space inside. Something was wrong. Something was in there. I reached for the closet door, my hand trembling so badly that I had to steady it against the frame. I yanked it open, half expecting something to jump out at me, but again, nothing. Just my clothes hanging neatly on their hangers, shoes lined up on the floor. But as I stood there, my breath catching in my throat, I saw it, barely visible, hidden in the shadow of the closet. A small, wet footprint. It was the size of a child's foot, but smeared, like someone had tracked mud, or worse, into the house. Panic surged through me. Whoever had been in my house was still here. I backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to get help. I bolted down the stairs, grabbing my coat and slipping into my boots, not even bothering to tie them. Jasper followed close behind, barking hysterically now. I ran out the front door, into the snow, not stopping until I reached the house next door. I banged on the door, desperate, my breath coming out in ragged gasps, the cold biting at my skin. Mrs. Harper, my elderly neighbor, opened the door, her face full of concern as she pulled me inside. "What's wrong, dear? What happened?" I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. Someone was in my house. I heard them, they were upstairs. I think they're still there." She immediately called the police, her hand shaking as she held the phone to her ear. I sat on her couch, Jasper at my feet, his body still tense, his eyes locked on the front door. I could hear Mrs. Harper's voice, calm but firm, telling the police what had happened, asking them to come quickly. But the snow was coming down harder now, and it took nearly 40 minutes for the police to arrive. By the time they got there, any footprints outside had been buried beneath a fresh layer of snow. They searched the house, every room, every closet, but they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry. No broken windows. Nothing. But when they checked the security footage from the camera I had installed in the backyard, it showed something chilling. Just moments after I had run out of the house, a figure dressed in dark clothing could be seen slipping out the back door. He moved quickly, jumping over the fence and disappearing into the woods behind my house. They never found him. For weeks after that night, I couldn't sleep. I changed all the locks, installed new cameras, but it didn't matter. I still felt him there, watching, waiting. And every now and then, when the house is quiet, and the wind is howling outside, I swear I can hear those footsteps again. I'll never forget that winter. It changed me. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe in my own home again. It was one of those bitterly cold winter nights in Ohio, the kind where the wind howls through the streets like a banshee, and the snowflakes seemed to float like frozen whispers from the sky. I was at home, tucked under a thick blanket on the couch, a steaming cup of tea in hand, watching the flakes dance in the streetlight outside. My older sister, Mia, had gone to spend the night with her boyfriend, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room of our small apartment. The silence was palpable, broken only by the occasional creaking of the old house settling around me. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just past 7 p.m. I should have felt cozy and safe, but unease gnawed at me. I had been trying to reach my father, Robert, for the past hour. He had lost his sight a few years back, and while he was fiercely independent, I worried about him more than I liked to admit. He lived alone in a small apartment about 20 minutes away, and though I knew he was capable, my mind raced with worries as the phone rang and rang, only to be met with silence. After a few more futile attempts, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. The snow had begun to pile up, and the weather report had warned of worsening conditions. I pulled on my coat and grabbed my keys, reminding myself to drive carefully. As I stepped outside, the chill hit me like a slap. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way to the car, and I could feel the weight of the storm settling around me. The drive was treacherous. The roads were slick with ice, and visibility was low. My heart raced as I navigated through the swirling snow, my mind darting back to images of my father, his easy laughter, the way he would talk about the world with such passion, even though he couldn't see it anymore. I had to make sure he was okay. After what felt like an eternity, I finally pulled up in front of his building. The snow had already blanketed the area, making everything look surreal, like a scene from a ghostly fairy tale. I stepped out of the car and trudged through the snow to the entrance, knocking lightly on the door before letting myself in. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. I made my way to his apartment and knocked again, calling out to him. "Dad? It's me, Sam." Silence answered me. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a darkened living room. I stepped inside and called out again, my voice wavering slightly. "Dad, are you here?" The air inside was heavy with an unusual stillness, and a shiver crawled up my spine. As I looked around, I noticed something odd. The front door had been left ajar, and the kitchen lights were still on, casting an eerie glow against the walls. I moved deeper into the apartment, heart pounding. "Dad?" That's when I saw them, footprints in the snow leading from the front door to the kitchen and back. My stomach dropped as I knelt down to inspect them. They were fresh, but how could they be? The last time I had spoken to my father, he was home, safe. Just then, I heard the faint sound of laughter outside. I rushed to the window and peered through the frosted glass. I saw one of our neighbors, an older man named Frank, who lived a few doors down. He was waving to someone in a car parked at the curb. My heart raced again. If Frank was outside, maybe he had seen my dad. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold once more. "Frank!" I called out, hoping my voice would carry over the gusting wind. He turned, his face lighting up with recognition. "Sam! What brings you here?" "I can't reach my dad. I'm worried he's home alone." "Did you see him?" Frank nodded, his expression shifting to concern. "Yeah, I saw him a little while ago. He went to the store to grab some supplies. Should be back soon." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly overshadowed by a gnawing anxiety. "Are you sure? I just found the door open, and I'm not sure if everything is okay." Frank frowned. "You should go check on him, just to be safe." With a nod, I turned back towards the apartment. I decided to wait for my father to return, feeling somewhat reassured that he was out. I settled back into the living room, trying to shake off the uneasiness that lingered in the air. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The minutes crawled by, the wind howling like a creature outside, and I took the opportunity to scan the apartment for anything unusual. That's when I noticed the bathroom door was closed, and the shower curtain drawn tight. My father was meticulous about keeping things tidy, so why would he leave it like that? Feeling a knot tighten in my stomach, I moved towards the bathroom. "Dad?" I called softly. "Is everything all right?" Silence hung heavy in the air, and I took a step closer. The door was shut tight. I reached for the handle, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I was about to turn it, I hesitated. This wasn't normal. I backed away, feeling a cold sweat forming on my forehead. Whatever was going on, I needed help. I quickly pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation to the operator. They assured me they would send someone right away, and I hung up, trying to calm my racing heart. While I waited, I decided to step back outside, taking a deep breath of the cold air. I could see Frank still standing at the curb, chatting with someone else. I turned back to the apartment, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be happening inside. The cold chill of dread settled into my bones as I waited, the wind howling a haunting tune around me. The sound of sirens pierced through the storm, a welcome relief that sent a wave of adrenaline rushing through me. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser, their breath visible in the frigid air. I rushed to meet them, anxiety clawing at my insides. "Please, you have to help me," I said, my voice shaky. "I can't reach my dad, and I found the door open. Something feels off." The officers exchanged glances before one of them nodded. "All right, let's check it out together." We made our way inside, the door creaking as we entered the darkened apartment. The officers turned on their flashlights, illuminating the dim space. I followed closely, anxiety bubbling to the surface as we approached the bathroom. "Stay here," one officer instructed, gesturing for the other to join him. I stood frozen, heart pounding in my chest, as they approached the bathroom door. They knocked gently, calling out for my father. When there was no answer, they exchanged another glance, and one officer slowly turned the handle. As the door creaked open, my breath caught in my throat. The sight that greeted us was both shocking and surreal. There, in my father's bedroom, sat a man I had never seen before, slumped against the bed, his eyes wide and filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "Hands where I can see them!" one of the officers barked, and the intruder slowly raised his hands, surrendering without a fight. My heart raced as I processed what was happening. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice rising in a mixture of anger and fear. He glanced at me, his expression oddly calm. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just looking for something." "Looking for what?" I snapped, stepping closer, needing answers. Before he could respond, the officers stepped forward, taking control of the situation. They cuffed him and led him out of the bedroom, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me, mingled with an overwhelming rage. As they questioned him, I retreated to the living room, my mind racing. How had he gotten in? Why was he in my father's room? The unanswered questions gnawed at me, and I wished my father were there, offering his steady presence. Minutes felt like hours as the officers continued their questioning. Eventually, one of them approached me, his expression serious. "Your father is fine, but we need to talk to you about what just happened." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Where is he?" "He's not here right now. He was at the store when we arrived. This man," he gestured to the intruder, "has been watching him for some time. We believe he was waiting for an opportunity to break in." My stomach turned. "But why?" "He thought your father wouldn't put up a fight. It seems he was looking for valuables." The officer's words sent chills down my spine. I thought about my father, alone and vulnerable, and the anger bubbled back up. "He didn't take anything, did he?" The officer shook his head. "No, we caught him before he could." A sense of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. "You don't understand. My father's been through enough. He shouldn't have to deal with this." As the officers took the intruder away, I stood in the doorway, watching the snow swirl around them. My father returned not long after, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded. When I explained what had happened, he took it all in stride, but I could see the weariness in his eyes. In the days that followed, I convinced my father to hire a lawyer, despite his reluctance to press charges. The intruder was charged with third-degree burglary and is now serving time. Life has returned to a fragile normalcy, but every time I visit my father's apartment, I can't help but glance at the bathroom door, half expecting to see those footprints in the snow leading in and out again.